Well, breaking news, Donald Trump has declared the US is ceasing all trade negotiations with Canada.
Trump says, we're going to put tariffs on the potash from Canada.
The United States has struck a deal with Russian ally Belarus.
Belarus has freed more than 120 political prisoners in a major thaw in relations with the United States. The releases came in return for Washington lifting sanctions on potash, a key source of revenue for Belarus.
Yeah, well, the reason why he did it was, as part of the deal, was to release the potash.
President Alexander Lukashenko has freed more than 100 political prisoners. Trump, in return, is easing sanctions against Belarus on a key agricultural export.
Yes, the promise to import potash from Belarus. This lifted the sanctions on it.
Sidelines.
The lifting of sanctions on Belarus Carney, which is a key company for Belarusian export and one of the biggest potash exports.
Something big just happened in the fertilizer world, and most people only caught the humanitarian headline. The United States quietly cut a deal with Belarus, a close ally of Russia, and the ripple effects hit Canada almost immediately. Belarus released more than 120 political prisoners.
That threat suddenly became real.
More important to him, to Lukashenko, it was the lifting of sanctions on Belarus Carney, which is a key company for Belarusian export and one of the biggest potash exports.
In return, Washington moved to lift or ease sanctions tied to Belarusian potash, one of the country's most important export earners and a major input for global fertilizer. On paper, it sounds straightforward. Prisoners out. Sanctions eased. Relations normalize. But in practice, this move reopens a supply channel that had been restricted for years, and it changes the balance of power in North American agricultural trade. Because potash is not a small commodity. It is one of the ingredients that keeps modern farming running, and farming is food. When you change who can sell potash into the biggest market in the world, you don't just move prices, you move leverage. Here's why Canada took this so personally. The US imports the vast majority of the potash it uses each year, and for a long time, Canada has been the dominant supplier. That dominance gave Ottawa quiet influence without needing to throw its weight around. When one partner supplies most of a critical input, that partner doesn't need to issue threats to have power. The leverage is built into the relationship. But leverage only lasts until alternatives appear. By letting Belarus back into the game, the US doesn't need to replace Canadian potash to weaken Canada's position. It only needs to create an option. Even a partial alternative changes negotiations, pricing expectations, and political calculations. It turns Canada from essential partner into main supplier, for now. That for now is where the power shifts. And what stings even more is the way it happened. Canada wasn't consulted. There was no warning. No serious coordination with allies. The decision came out of Washington as a done deal, delivered through channels that looked less like a partnership and more like a transaction. Canada found itself treated like a vendor waiting for a purchase order, not like a strategic partner whose economy is deeply tied to this trade. Now add another ingredient: Donald Trump's tariff threats. Around the same time, Trump was floating very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, signaling that the US would stop accepting high prices from foreign suppliers and start pushing more domestic production. In the past, that kind of threat had a built-in limit, because US farmers rely on steady, affordable fertilizer. If a tariff spike hit too hard, the political backlash would be immediate and loud. But Belarus changes that political math. Once Washington can point to an alternative supplier, tariff threats become more believable. Not because Belarus can instantly replace Canada, but because the US can argue it has options, which lowers its exposure. Negotiation tactics change when the person across the table believes you can walk away. And the market doesn't wait for tariffs to be imposed. Markets react to credibility. The moment a threat sounds real, You can see it in investment decisions, stock prices, long-term contracts, and expansion plans. That's the kind of damage that doesn't make a dramatic headline, but it quietly shapes the next decade. If you're following this because you want clear, real-world breakdowns of how political deals hit markets, farmers, and entire economies, make sure you subscribe. These stories move fast, and the details matter more than the slogans. Now zoom out, because this deal isn't only a Canada story, it's also a Western unity story. Europe has kept sanctions in place and continued isolating Belarus, especially given its alignment with Russia and the way its territory has been used by Russian forces. The EU has even moved to tighten restrictions in certain areas, while Washington moved in the opposite direction by cutting a bilateral deal. Overnight, you get two different approaches: transactional in the US, confrontational in Europe. When the West acts in sync, smaller allies get cover. There's strength in a united front, but when strategies fracture, the countries that rely on collective pressure lose protection. Canada ends up caught in the middle, still tied to the old alignment, but suddenly dealing with a US that's playing a more flexible, deal-by-deal game. And then comes pricing. Belarusian potash is produced by a state-linked system that can operate with different incentives than a private sector producer. That matters because it can enter markets with thinner margins, tolerate lower profits for strategic gain, and still keep volumes moving. Even limited re-entry can influence what buyers consider an acceptable price ceiling. Canadian producers, especially in Saskatchewan, depend on stable pricing and long-term planning. Potash. Mining isn't a quick pivot industry. Developing new mines takes years, often a decade or more. You can't just build more tomorrow, because politics changed. So when prices flatten or uncertainty rises, companies get cautious. Projects delay. Hiring slows. Local suppliers feel it. Towns that rely on mining activity feel it. The pain arrives in slow motion, contract by contract, quarter by quarter. Saskatchewan is a giant in this story. It produces a huge share of the world's potash, and a massive portion of that output goes to U.S. farmers. If Canadian suppliers lose pricing power or face tariff risk that pushes buyers to diversify, the first visible effects won't be a dramatic collapse. It'll be smaller signals, softer forecast, cautious capital spending, delayed expansions, quieter equipment orders. That's what makes it dangerous. People ignore it until the momentum is already gone, and there's a strategic angle that should make Ottawa nervous. Belarus, returning to the supply picture, gives Washington more room to pressure Canada without hurting itself as quickly. Previously, serious tariff threats risked immediate blowback from American farmers. That constraint mattered. Now that constraint is weaker. The U.S. can talk tougher, push harder, and assume it has at least some cushioning. Even if Belarus can't fully replace Canada, it doesn't need to. Optionality is enough. That's the real shift here. Not independence, but flexibility. Enough alternative supply to make threats credible. Enough alternative supply to reduce domestic political risk. Enough alternative supply to make Canada hesitate before responding aggressively, because retaliation becomes more costly when your buyer thinks it can shop elsewhere. That hesitation becomes policy, and markets notice. Investors and buyers don't just price what is happening today. They price what could happen next. Once the idea takes hold that Canada's potash industry is exposed to sudden tariff shocks, contract terms harden. Buyers seek more protective clauses, producers face higher uncertainty premiums, and that raises costs even before a single tariff is enacted. You can already see how companies position themselves when they sense future growth might shift south. One of the most telling signals in stories like this is where new infrastructure gets built. When major Canadian producers decide to invest in export facilities and logistics on the US side rather than at home, that's not just about efficiency. It's about reading the political map and choosing the safest route for future access. Now step back again, because there's an even darker lesson buried in this deal. This arrangement sends a signal to authoritarian states that political prisoners can become bargaining chips. In simple terms, hold people, hold resources, wait for the right moment, then trade goodwill gestures for market access. It's a model that rewards coercion. Canada doesn't operate that way. Canada trades on reliability, contracts, and rule-based systems. That approach works best when the global system actually rewards trust. But if the world shifts toward power deals, leverage tactics, and political choke points, then being reliable stops being a competitive advantage and starts being something others exploit. And that's why this isn't just a fertilizer story. It's a blueprint story. If trading prisoner releases for commodity access becomes normal, and if sanctions become negotiable based on strategic supply needs, then markets learn a brutal lesson. Ethics are flexible when prices are high and supplies are tight. That encourages more governments to test the boundaries, and it punishes countries that play strictly by the rulebook. Canada didn't lose because it broke rules. Canada lost because the rules stopped being the only game in town. For decades, Canada could assume that being the stable, dependable supplier was a form of protection. That stability created a kind of quiet loyalty. But loyalty is not a contract. The moment the US found an alternative it could use, even imperfectly, the relationship shifted from partnership to pricing.